Archives TV in the house once again, here with my friend Terry Riggs, HKTH Knowledge and Travels, here at the Victorian Albert Museum. Information by black people for black people. Here we go.
Hello everyone, this is Terry Riggs here, the UK travel guide to the rest of the world, and we've got a special person for you today. And this guy is a historian, he's a mentor to me in the renaissance of black presence in this country. Right now, Michael is going to define everything outside this Victorian Albert Museum and explain a lot of things that we don't see within this place. Michael.
Thanks for that introduction, Terry. The V&A is, to me, one of the most exciting museums in the whole of Britain. Let me tell you why. Because the art in here is all about art with a purpose. Art has form and function. It does something. Not only is it beautiful, but it has a purpose. And we'll be looking at the black presence, or people of African descent, first as objects, and I'll show you them as some 12th, 13th, 14th century objects. But as we move through time, we bring it right up to date when you see black people actually creating cultural capital. And we'll, if time permits, on this tour, maybe on another tour, we'll look at the work of Paul Boateng, or the suit designer, or we'll look at the work of John Daniels, the designer. We're seeing that black people, in the day, they were objects. Today they are creating objects, they're creating cultural capital. But I want you to just take a few moments to look at the entry to the V&A here, and the sign. The excellence of every art must consist in the complete accomplishment of its purpose. If it's not beautiful, then we don't do it. This is something that comes comes to the heart of African design. Why do I say that? Because if you look at some pieces, next time you look at an African comb or an African stool, you'll see not only is it beautiful, it has function, has purpose. Because the art respected the designer, the maker. There was a connection between the maker and the purpose of the art. Art had function, and that goes to the very nature of African art. But that discussion is for another day. We'll start our talk, our walk through the V&A in the Renaissance.
Back again, now we're inside the Victorian Albert Museum. As I said, Michael here, my mentor, and he's going to show us around, because you got to watch out, because we're going to have a tour in the Victorian Albert Museum. So, and this is going to be our biggest tour guide. This is someone that we inspired to show us around in this place. So now, Michael, why are we here anyway? Because I've been looking at these artifacts.
Well, we're in the Renaissance, the medieval Renaissance wing of the V&A, because here we're going to see some of the earliest portrayals of black people, or people of African descent, in the V&A collection, and people who clearly identify as black people. I start here because this is really where art and design come together. All the work you see here had a purpose. It did two things. One, it glorified God. That was important, because back in those days, God-fearing meant something. The works were done for the glory of God, but it glorified the patron, the person who put the money in to make the piece. If you look around, you'll see that the size of the pieces reflect the bigness or the importance of the patron. So when we look at the art here, think about that. The glorifying God, but also glorifying the patron.
I want to ask one question. You see, with that emblem, I always wanted to know what type of family that is.
Well, but this is a typical Renaissance emblem, where we're seeing a ceramic tile with symbols which reflect the history of that family. Now, I don't know this particular family. We're looking at some emblems later on, but I want you just you can see that this is a time that people didn't read, so symbols were important. Yeah. So all of those symbols, the grapes, the lemons, the vertical lines, they all have meaning. And I would imagine that the shield in the center would indicate the union of several families. Mm-hmm. We've got the Florentine symbols from Florence and other parts of Europe there. But I'll be honest, I don't know for certain those. But I'll show you some other ones later on.
Okay. All right. Now, Now we're going to move into some other places.
This is a very typical monochromed altarpiece from the early 16th century, and it's as I say, it's an altarpiece, and we've got the Mary with the Madonna with the child Jesus on her lap, surrounded by two saints. And if you look around the panels, we have on the top left, we can see the Annunciation, where the angel visits Mary to say she's going to have a baby. Then if you look on the right there, we see that in the manger, she has the baby in the manger. And then the scene that really interests us here, when the three kings visit us. And if you look very carefully, you can see the Black King on the edge. And this is a very, very typical portrayal of the Black King. First, he's often the youngest. And he's always at the edge of the scene. And he's always dressed in a very, very fashionable way. You know, okay, it may not be fashion to us, but in his day, that would have been high fashion. So this is youth, and here what we're looking at, the three ages of man. We've got the older man at the front, the middle-aged man, and the youth. And not just any youth, but a black youth. So what they're trying to portray here is the whole of humanity.
Yeah.
Because at this time, there was a great belief in the end times. The end times, the 1500, that was going to be the end of the world. And so the Bible predicted that all would come together.
Okay.
All would come together. So this is kind of a prediction of the whole world coming together. And black people, white people, are all part of that whole world. Just a few notes about this actual altarpiece. You see it's gold. That gold is very important. And you see these doors, because that would have been shut for most of the year, and it only came out on literally holidays. Holy days or holidays, and it was opened. And I want to imagine a darkened church with candlelit, flickering with the gold. This was a very magical thing, because something that's very important to keep in mind when we look at these images is what I call the period eye. And by that I mean having some sense of how the person back in the day would have looked at that. Some people argue that at that time, the peasants would have seen, or let me put it another way, a New Yorker sees more images in one day than this peasant would have seen his entire life. So these images were really important and precious. They were really means of educating people, letting them know how they related to the world and how the world relates to them. So images were really, really important. And so I'll show you some other images. But this, as I say, is a very typical adoration scene with the three kings, the three kings under Black King, and as the youth, the middle-aged king and the older king. And always the older king is always the first. He's the first. And it's an interesting image, the three kings, because it represents the first people to visit. The first people to visit the baby Jesus were not ordinary people. They were kings. That's important, because this image is a fabrication. But it's important for if you're an elite or a prince or a king, you want to know you're connected to God because you were there because God put you there. So this is all evidence of the fact that you're related to God. That's important. The fact that your kings are put there by God. So at this time, it would have been challenging to be a peasant, because there was only two people in town you looked to. One was the church, and the other was the king. Taxes to one, ties to the other. But we'll talk about another time, and perhaps we'll touch that later on as we move through.
Okay. Yep. Now we move on to the next piece. Ready? Back once again. Now we're coming to this artifact. I've always looked at this artifact because of certain statements as it says. But Michael, please explain to us about this.
This is the Marnhill orrery. First, a few words what an orrery is. An orrery was the cross, as you see, this crucifix formation, which sat on the back of the chasuble. And if we look to our left, if we just look to our left here, we can see a chasuble. This was a kind of a cloak that the piece was put over his head, and on it were pictures from the life of Christ. Because keep in mind, this is a time that people didn't read, so people were being educated in the life and times of Christ. And this was on the awful offering was on the back of a chasuble. Now, why is it here in the V&A? Quite simply, it is the most exquisite example of opus angelicum. Opus angelicum was English needlework from the 12th and 13th century, highly valued across Europe for the detail of it. And this is a supreme example of it. So keep in mind when I talk about form and function in the V&A, this has a purpose. This was the work of an embroiderer from the early 13th century. And if we look at it, what it portrays is the Passion of Christ. And we work we start from the bottom. This panel shows Christ being scourged. If we move up, we see him being flogged as he takes his cross up. And here he's on the cross, surrounded by Mary and John, and flanked by the saints, St. Peter and St. Paul. And what's interesting about this work is you can read it. You can read it from a cultural point of view. First, let's look at the way the people are dressed. You'll notice the people beating Christ, they're showing us smaller. Keep in mind, size matters. So these are not as important as Christ in their size. And they're wearing these short tunics. Just the same, the figure beating Christ, carrying the cross, shorter than Christ with the tunic on, which doesn't flow to the ground. But if we go to the top, the cross here, we see the saints, St. Mary, St. John, their garments flow. Now this is the garments to the ground date back to Roman times, and these were elites. These were not farm workers. These were not peasants. These were people with money. They were the ruling class. And if we look a little harder, we can see here St. Peter is a very interesting character. St. Peter was the first pope, and the Bible it says, "I'll give you the keys to the kingdom." So we can see the keys, and he said, "On this rock I shall build my church." And we can see Peter's actually standing on a rock. We can see him standing on a rock. So this is a typical place from this period where you can actually read. You can read into the person, who they are and their role in society. Equally, if we come back to our people here, you'll notice these variegated stockings here. This is typical of a way of portraying people who are not part of society, people who are outside society, because it comes from a mistranslation of Leviticus, which talks about you should not have two different cloths together. You shouldn't leather and cotton. Okay. But it was mistranslated. You shouldn't have two colors together. So we have the two colors here, indicating that these people are not obeying the word of God. They are sinning in their very dress. And I was first attracted to this from a piece from the 12th century Doomsday book, the Doomsday of Erato. There's a black character dressed very similar to this in the short tunic with the variegated hosiery, indicating that he was outside society. He was not one of us, so to speak. He was different. So some would say this is the black person shown as others. Other people say, well, they look a bit Jewish. Either way, for me, I believe these characters here are black. You can tell from their tight curly hair. There's a very much black character. And here we even look, this character is being demonized, almost like horns on his head as he beats Christ. So we see here pieces that show the black presence, but in a negative way, not in a positive way. But that was the understanding that the black character was outside society. He was a demon, and this was their way of portraying a demon at that time.
Okay. But yeah, Michael, but you know what? One thing I was always noticed, right, as you've described all that, is how they've portrayed us as a dark-skinned, evil person. Please explain that to me.
Well, I can't explain it. I can only tell what it is. The fact that you see what it says here. It says the dark color and the ugly face of the persecuted. And this is, remember, this is a time when people don't read.
Yeah.
So caricature is important. So if a person is bad, he looks bad.
Yeah.
But so as a consequence, they're portrayed. If a person is good, he's painted as beautiful.
Yeah.
You know, things were taken very literal in those days.
Yeah.
Like, sweet breath meant you were a healthy person.
Yeah.
You know, bad breath meant you were an evil person.
Yeah.
So in the same way, the way you portrayed the person reflected who the person was, because it was the portrait meant so much at that time.
Okay. All right, then. Thank you, Michael. Let's go to the next artifact and talk about that one. Yes, Michael. As you was explaining about the altars and what this kind of gives a significant thing to us.
This to me is one of the most exciting spaces in the Medren, in the V&A. And why? Because what they've done here, they've recreated the nave of an Italian church. We've got the high altar at the front, and then we're surrounded by altars. If you go to Italy, you see these altars. This construction exists to this day, and these altars, these altar pieces would be for particular families. They'd buy a niche in the church, and the family would, some of the members of the family would be buried in that particular altar piece, or before that particular altar piece. Masses would be said in the particular altar pieces before the for the particular altar piece. And we're going to look at one particular altar piece here. This is a porcelain altar piece by Della Robbia. Now again, why is it here in the V&A? One, because it's an excellent example of the terracotta skill he developed. He developed a terracotta, a glazing process that could work outside, that was robust enough to withstand the outside conditions. What's fascinating about it? There was one color he couldn't get, and he couldn't get red. You couldn't get red, so you can see the red is actually missing from the work. But in his glazing, he could get greens, yellows, blues, but not reds. And as I said at the start of this talk, the pieces here are for one of two reasons. One, to glorify God, and this we're doing here in this altar piece, but also to glorify the patron. And the patron, this is to be found here in the symbols here of the family that funded this altar piece. Yeah.
Okay.
So now if we look for the black presence here, the black presence again is at the very back. But this time he's not king. He's not the king. He's shown as an attendant.
Is there any particular reason about that?
Well, okay. Now this is my own theory. Yeah. My own theory. This is an Italian piece. Yeah. The black king is principally a German thing from the 13th, 14th century onwards. It's a German motif, and it didn't come into Italy until the late 15th century. And the 16th century. Yeah. Prior to that, there were black people, but they weren't kings. It was quite. Italy came much later to it. Okay. So we see the black presence there is shown as almost certainly a slave, because slaves were well known in Italy, being purchased from Spain and Portugal. Yeah. And there's a well documented trade, and they were given as presents to children, and they grew up with them. So the black presence in Italy goes back. Mm-hmm. At least to the 1450s, when they first imported from Portugal and Spain. Mm-hmm. And he's shown here as a helper, as a kind of a guy helping the others minister to the baby Jesus. And you look here, you've got the older man, the older king at the front with his hat off, respectively, adoring the baby Jesus. A middle-aged king, and then the younger king, the youth king. And
that's like on the other one we saw.
Exactly.
It was a black person.
Exactly, and we'll see that was replaced by a black person. As I say, my belief it came to Italy much later than it was in Germany. Because I would argue, when we look at a German piece later on, it was also a political statement having the three kings, and one of them was black in your church.
Okay. Okay.
Let's move on.
Next. Yeah, Black Eyes TV 7 once again.
Okay. This is an interesting piece to dissect, because symbolism is very important. So we have to. Each person has a symbol, and that symbol says a bit about themselves. So we're looking here at the older king. He's put his crown on the floor, and he's showing the money. Sorry, his gift to the baby Jesus. He's paying his homage. And he's flanked by two kings, because those kings are both carrying gifts. Well, this character, I believe, is Joseph. He's bareheaded, and he's revering the baby Jesus. So I would believe that these two on the outside are the two kings, particularly when you look at the black magus figure at the edge here. You'll see he has his gift. He's taken off his hat respectfully, and he's about to come into the scene. Again, you notice he's on the edge of the scene. He's not directly part of the scene. One of the things, this is very much a personal thing from my point of view. Most times, the Black King doesn't look into the scene. There's no eye contact. Whereas eye contact is very important in Renaissance paintings. And you can see that when you look at because they help you look at the piece. Your eyes follow their eyes. And there are pieces where the black magus is looking out of the picture or looking in the opposite direction, as though to say he's not really part of the scene. Although he's in here, they have him here again. You see dressed as the youth. You see again with the very fashionable clothing for its day, unlike the draped clothing of the other kings. And he's the younger king. So he's an amalgamation of ideas here in terms of use, in terms of the whole world coming together. And we have the Black King, and I always see this as being not quite one of us. Okay. He's different.
Let me ask you something, right, Mike? You know, like, for instance, it's done in like the 14 and 1500s, yeah? You see how you see the black presence that we see now. Do they do it in the liking of how they saw them nowadays, in them at that period?
That's an interesting question, because you look at a piece and you can tell that the artist knew a black person. Yeah. You can tell. Some pieces, and we'll look at them later, I'll show you when we go later on in the tour, where the artist had no idea. Mm. He just did it from his mind. Looking at this piece, I have a sense that he had a feeling for it, but I'm not certain that he was that close to it. But you can tell, and that's why if we go back to the Della Robbia, it's very clearly that Della Robbia knew a black person. Yeah. You can see from the modeling and the face that he knew what a black person looked like, or in fact he knew a black person. And it would be interesting to compare the two faces, the faces of the two.
All right then, Michael. Let's move on and go to the next piece. Black Eyes TV. Make sure you watch it. Make sure you go to YouTube. It's Black Eyes TV 7, all one word. Make sure you're there and see everything that you can see. Remember this is the UK tour guide to the rest of the world. Anyway, as remember before when we spoke about this artifact about St. Maurice, now my mentor is going to explain the full details about this artifact here, and you're going to be amazed on what he's got to say.
Oh, thank you for that introduction, Ola. This to me is one of the most interesting, if not problematic, black presences in the V&A. First, why is it in the V&A? Because it's the work of Tilman Riemensteiner, one of the greatest wood carvers of his day. A very sympathetic carver who create the most exquisite pieces. And then you can see in the face there, a beautifully rendered face, an exquisite artist. Some argue this particular piece, he only did the face, and that the body was done by his workshop. Nevertheless, it's an imposing piece. It's believed to be part of an altarpiece set. There would be two either side of the altarpiece. Then we have to ask ourselves, why is it called St. Maurice? Well, it has the attributes of St. Maurice, so they've gone. It had a shield, a stone Roman shield, and he had a spear, a long spear, as part of his armory. And also, if you look closely, it says M on the shield. And we believe he has the woolly hair of a black man, but certainly that face is not the face of a black man, and that troubled me for a long time. And we'll come back to that in a moment. If I tell you a little bit about the St. Maurice story. St. Maurice dates back to Thebes, Roman Thebes. He was a centurion, and he was ordered by the emperor to go and attack some people in France. So from Thebes, which is in Ethiopia, a legion was sent to France, and that legion was instructed to destroy or to stop the people worshipping Christ. Now, The leader was St. Maurice, or Maurice at that time, before he became a saint. He became a saint much later. Maurice refused to attack the French people because he believed in what they believed in. He was a Christian. And what happened was the emperor got a bit annoyed at that, so he decided to destroy 1 in 10 of his legion. But still, they refused to attack. And in the end, the emperor destroyed the whole legion. And that became a symbol. St. Maurice then became a symbol of a soldier who stood up for Christ. He stood up to the emperor. He stood up to the king. He stood up to a higher value. Because at this time, remember that there's 2 powers in town. One is the church, the other is the king. And ultimately, the king pays homage to the church, to king. And earlier we talked about the first people to visit the baby Jesus, or the first Gentiles, the first non-Jews to visit Jesus, was kings, recognizing how important the kings or the elites saw themselves. So here is St. Maurice, is a symbol of how kings could glorify God. In fact, St. Maurice is a symbol, lasted for almost 1,000 years in the Catholic Church in Austria. He's still part of the emblems of the Austrian king. But this is a little more. Let me tell you a little bit more about this face here. Now, there's some dispute now whether this really is St. Maurice. I've had some discussions with the V&A about, is this really St. Maurice? And we now don't believe it is St. Maurice. And I'm happy to believe that, because that does not, that he hasn't got the attributes of the classical St. Maurice, or the real St. Maurice. I'm talking about the St. Maurice in the Magdeburg Cathedral, the first black African, the first black African to be portrayed in Western art. And not just portrayed in a very sympathetic way. As we discussed earlier, in those pieces, you could tell when the artist had seen a black man. When you look at that St. Maurice, you can see clearly that the artist had some sense of a black person, of how a black man would look. Why he's black, we have no idea. We have absolutely no idea why. What we do know that St. Maurice was white up until about 1350, when the emperor said, I want him to be black, period. And from that day on, he's black. Now, that says 2 things. First, what the emperor says goes. And the second thing is, if you have a black St. Maurice, that means you're aligned to the emperor. You're part of his family. You're part of his protected. So not only is it a religious statement, it's a political statement. And you'll see it's interesting that as we move across Europe, and you look at the St. Maurice is black, and it gets less and less black, and predominantly white when we get to France. And when we come to England, there are very, very few St. Maurices, because that story never came over here. So there's very few churches called St. Maurice. So to bring it right up to date now, you see it's still got the sign St. Maurice 1510 Tilman Ringsteiner. I would argue that there's an opportunity here for the V&A, even if this isn't, even if it isn't St. Maurice, maybe they should put a small plaque here of comparing with the Magdeburg St. Maurice. Yeah. So you can compare and contrast, so you can see that black presence, or that black thinking, that black ideas were there in the 15th century and speak to us to this day.
Thank you, Michael.